You're listening to episode 55 of the Confident Writer podcast with Jane Pike. Hello, you glorious human. It has been a little while. The podcast has taken a siesta, can I say that? A break of sorts over the last few weeks or couple of weeks, and it was completely unintentional and completely unplanned. But life kind of whacked me between the eyeballs and I had to step back and reassess what more information I could process out of my brain space. So we're back and I'm excited to be back and I have so much to share and so many plans. And I kind of don't know where to get started. I'm sitting here with my dog Stella. I'm telling you that because potentially if she sees something interesting outside, you could hear some vocals from her in the background. But for the moment, we are just going to sit and talk and see what's going on in the world and just catch you up on the latest from what's been happening with me, basically. So I am super excited, freaking excited, one might say, because the last 2 months, I think it's 2 months. I'd have to go back on the actual calendar to have a look at the timeline, but I'm going to go with 2 months. The last 2 months, I have been pedal to the metal. I have been going hard, creating new content for my membership program. And in the first instance, when I first had this inkling that I wanted to change things, I tried to ignore it for a while because the fact is I had created a membership program and a whole bunch of content that really took a lot of work. And so when you start to reevaluate things and think about kind of up leveling and where you want to take things, and when that involves like a complete restructure, it's kind of a lot to get your head around. But in the end, it wasn't really a decision as much as a necessity, because I'm in the space, just as you guys are, of constantly learning, constantly growing and expanding. And a lot of that is formed, well, like all of it is informed by my own experience, by the experience of the incredible people that I get to work with. And I'm just addicted to that constant knowledge, to really just learning and listening to different people and assimilating different information. And I had one experience, when was that? Last year sometime, or a little while back, where I really had to dive deeper into my own stuff, but also look at coming at things from a different angle. So I'm going to share that with you shortly, because it's kind of a really big part of why I decided to change things up. And I think you're going to be really interested to hear about it, because the same principles, although your stories might be different, the principles are going to apply across the board. Before I get into that though, what I do want to say is next Monday, the 29th of June, 2020 at 8:30 a.m. in the morning, New Zealand time, I am having a free webinar or workshop. It's online, so you can access it wherever you are in the world. And it is called Presence, Power and Partnership. And we're going to talk about a lot of things in there. For the most part, we're going to be discussing how it is we can increase our capacity. And capacity is a word that I love. I think it's a really pertinent word because it takes us beyond just managing anxiety, fear, frustration, all of the things that you might come to associate with at some point over your writing life and just life generally. We're really looking to increase our window of tolerance, increase the zone that we feel like, you know what, I've got this. I feel good about life. I can do this. And when we increase that zone, then we actually have more ability to hold different levels of activation in our body. And we increase the capacity also, I keep repeating the same words, but we increase our capacity to hold those emotions, those big emotions, experiences and energies before we feel the need to go offline. And what I mean by go offline is before we feel the need to switch into sympathetic activation, where we are operating purely from the smoke alarm system of our brain, the survival mechanism of our brain, And at that point, possibility doesn't feel available to us. We are basically in the zone of just looking out for danger, looking out for negative possibility. And we're not in the space of being able to recognize that there is more in our surroundings, more in our zone of possibility than we are actually paying attention to. Yes, so please sign up for that. If you want to get on board with that, you can just go to my website, confidentwriter.online, and you will see the little box on the homepage that will take you to the sign up page. But I will also post a link to that in my show notes. So I've had an incredible amount of people sign up for that so far, and I'm really excited to share all the ins and outs of what that's going to entail with you then. And we get to hang out. Super fun, super fun. So Joyride is open. It's been offline in terms of anyone wanting to sign up that wasn't already a part of it. That hasn't been possible for a little while, but I just opened this morning to those of you glorious souls who are on the wait list. And as of next week, when we kick off the webinar, it's going to be available to everyone else as well. But I wanted to talk to you about some of the understandings that have really led me to change things up a little bit. And by change things up, I mean really incorporate a few new different angles of coming at things, which have been game changers for me. So let me tell you a story. Let's go into story time to start with. I went to a clinic a while back and I took one of my horses with me. And I was really looking forward to the clinic. Like, don't get me wrong, I was amped up for it. I felt in a really good space. I felt like, we were going into it in a mode that I considered myself to be very teachable. However, what I didn't really realize at that point was the amount of pressure that I was putting on myself to show up as a good student, quote unquote. And I didn't realize that until after the fact. It was this deconstruction process after the clinic that led me to realize the kind of space that I actually entered it into with. And I guess the preceding weeks, months, years around that meant that I hadn't actually ridden out that much because I've got 2 young boys. All of my horses up until that stage were unstarted. So it represented a really big turning point for me to be able to take things, outside of the zone that I had been limited to at that point by not really through my own choice, but just through circumstance, and start to expand my horizons. So when I got there, what presented was my horse was very anxious, and that's totally fine. There were a few variables around different animals that he hadn't seen before that made him feel very excited about life. And that in and of itself is not a problem at all. Like I didn't go into it with any expectation of plain sailing. So this story is not about my horse's response, because that to me was completely appropriate, understandable, and I really felt nothing but compassion for him. But what I experienced personally was the real turning point, because the thing is, I study and live in the things that I discuss on this podcast every single minute. Like, this is my entire life. And when I'm talking about mindset exercises, mental skills, so on and so forth, I don't just have a theoretical understanding of the things that I'm putting out there. I really live them to the best of my ability, and they're accessible to me. I know what to use when. I have applied the rules, and I know what's what. But in this particular situation, I found myself not able to actually change my emotional state, change my feeling state for the better. And the pressure over the day, there are lots of different reasons that this happened, some of them justified and some of them apparently at the time feeling like, well, where is this coming from in terms of my own internal conversations? But what happened is over the course of the day, I found myself getting more and more frazzled. And layering on top of that was the shame, I guess, if you really want to cut to the chase, of thinking, like, I am the coach. I am the person here that is supposed to know this stuff. And yet here I am in the center of the arena feeling like I'm unraveling and I'm bringing to mind all of these things that I know how to apply, and yet it's not working. It's not enough. It's not enough in the moment for this energy. And when I got home, I really let myself go down the rabbit hole of feeling crappy about myself. It was a shame spiral, if I think about it, in terms of the high expectations that I place on myself to do the work that I teach, not just be a puppet, a performance puppet saying, yeah, do this, do that. This is not what I'm about. I'm not interested in that. What I teach is what I know and what I've integrated. And what I integrated at that point wasn't up to the mark. It was a little bit of the mark, but it wasn't enough to get me out of this space of feeling like I needed to come back down. I couldn't find my center. I couldn't find my baseline at that point. Now, like I say, there are lots of variables that when I pull it apart, I would change things in terms of how I led up to it, in terms of some decisions that I made at the actual clinic, but they are not the whole story. And so what happened afterwards was me thinking, well, how is it that I am going to change this story? Because I know for a fact I am not the only one that is going to go through this or has gone through this. I know this is the main thing that people come up against, right? Like, we manage to a certain stage, and that stage is variable depending on our experiences, depending on what our learnings are and what our skills are up to that point. But regardless, most of all of us in the horse world have had a manifestation with an experience of this at some point or another, where we've got ourselves outside the zone where we feel like we have the capacity to cope, and the resources that we had available or in our toolkit at that point just weren't up to scratch. And for me, I felt like I had a whole lot of resources. That's the thing. I had a whole lot of stuff that I could draw on. And yet in that moment, the anxiety was too much. The anxiety was overwhelming. And I felt immobilized by that. I went into what I now understand was a form of freeze. So why is this useful? Why is this important? Where are we going to take this? With that story in mind, I would now like to explain to you something that is called the window of tolerance. And the window of tolerance is a way of describing our nervous system capacity when we feel like we've kind of got it going on, when we feel like things are kind of okay. So the zone of okayness is our window of tolerance. And all of us have a different tolerance level. So if we think about tolerance, what are we thinking about tolerance to? Well, we're thinking about tolerance to a level of activation in our system. And when that activation exceeds our window, then we move into the sympathetic channel of flight, fight, and freeze. It's as simple as that. So what we are looking to do in increasing our capacity is to broaden this channel, broaden this window of tolerance, window of activation, for us to be able to hold more in our body without that experience becoming bigger than us. So as soon as an experience becomes bigger than our body's capacity to handle it, we go into fight, flight, or freeze, and beyond that into collapse, depending on where we are in the chain. Now, many of us are actually in a state of chronic dysregulation, meaning that we're never really truly coming back to a stable baseline where we feel like our system is settled and we feel like we have an empty cup that's able to fill back up again. Most of us are operating at a stage where our cup is already 80 to 90% full, and so it doesn't take much for our capacity level or our cup to overflow. And when we do that, when we don't understand why that is happening, and when we don't understand the complexity of past experiences that can lead up to us feeling that way or lead up to that nervous system dysregulation, then we start to internalize what it is that's going on. Instead of seeing it as an experience, instead of seeing the state of affairs or the state of feeling, the state of emotion, whatever it is that's happening for us as a situation that is reflective of a nervous system that has gone into haywire, we start to think that there's something wrong with us. And that is where we get into situations where we identify as an anxious rider, where we identify as someone who has anger issues, where we identify as someone that is fearful, for instance. These are all examples of a dysregulated nervous system, a situation where we've been unable to contextualize why it is we might feel the way that we do, and so instead we think that there's something wrong with us. Really key. Really, really key. So the other thing to understand about the window of tolerance is when we are in our window of tolerance, we have our higher wisdoming function available to us. And that higher wisdom is communicated to us through the prefrontal cortex. So if you were to place your hand on your forehead, that is where your prefrontal cortex lives. And that is what gives you the capacity to think things through logically, to be able to rationalize something, to think about what resources you have available to you, to think about what it is that you need to do in this situation in order to bring it through to a successful conclusion or completion for the sake of both you and your horse. It's also the place that allows you to stand in the midst of something and hold your center, hold your ground while the world is swirling around you, so that you're not getting pulled into other people's or your horse's or the situation's weather system. So you can see that having the ability to connect to this place, being able to reside and ride in your window of tolerance is absolutely vital. If we are not in that zone, we are functioning without that capacity. We are functioning without the capacity to be tuned in and plugged into our logical mind. And so when we're outside of that place, when we get outside our window of tolerance, what happens is that we operate instead from the smoke alarm portion of our brain, which is our limbic brain. And our limbic brain is what is responsible for those experiences of flight, fight, and freeze. If you were to place your hand on the back of your skull, just down near the occipital bones at the base of your neck, that is where your limbic brain lives. Evolutionarily, it is a lesser evolved version, but not a stupider version, just to point that out, than the prefrontal cortex. So when we are in a zone of sympathetic activation, please take note of this because it's really important, mindfulness techniques will not work. They will not work because your prefrontal cortex is not online. In order for mindfulness techniques to work, your prefrontal cortex has to be online. You have to be inside your window of tolerance. So in order for us to be able to make decisions, to be able to stay creative, to stay curious, to stay compassionate, we first need to come back to ourselves. We first need to come back to our bodies. And that is where I have completely changed up my entire system. And this is what I am doing within the scope of Joyride now, of understanding first up, where do we sit on this chain? Where are we on this scale? If I'm constantly hovering in low-grade worry, anxiety, concern, I know I am moving up towards the edge of my window of tolerance. Potentially I'm already over it, but I'm in the flight channel. Anxiety and fear are examples of flight responses. They are us wanting to move away from an experience or away from something. If I'm feeling irritation, frustration, I'm feeling a bit grumpy, they are low-grade fight responses. And if we feel like we are feeling those things all of the time, or we are moving into different levels of fight or flight, knowing that at the lower end of the flight scale, for instance, might be a little bit of worry or concern, and that could move all the way up the scale to full-blown panic. So knowing that is possible for us then tells us how many unfinished chains, how many unfinished cycles of sympathetic activation actually rest in our system. Now, what I mean by that is this. Every time we have some kind of activation in our system that doesn't come through to a regulated baseline. So we have a stressor, there's activation in the system. If you think of a wave going up, there is the apex of the wave where we actually meet that concern and remove ourselves, or we fight it, or there's some sense of completion, and then it comes back down to a regulated baseline. For many of us, we're not finishing that cycle. And so we have uncompleted experiences of sympathetic activation which stay stored in the nervous system. This is where we have experiences where we can show up to a situation and our response appears to be completely decontextualized. It appears to be that we are having an anxiety response, for instance, that is not appropriate for the moment. And when we're in that space, what we need to do is recognize it as an invitation to have an integrative experience with that energy. However, we need to know how to do that, right? That's the stuck point. It's one thing to know it, it's another thing how to do it, to know how to do it. So when I had this experience and then I started thinking about the applications, I started thinking about people that I worked with that consistently were stuck in different situations, different writing experiences and feeling states or emotional states, regardless of what it was we'd been doing, I started to realize that there were perhaps limitations to the way that I'd previously been going about things. And that's where I got curious. And so now the focus is still on mindset. However, it's not the first place that we go. The first thing that we need to do is understand how our nervous system works, so we have a real-world informed understanding of where we're sitting on the chain and what our tendencies are. Because most of us can predict the patterns. Most of us do have a pretty good clue about what it is that's going on in our bodies and where we sit. We just don't really have reference points for it. So that's a really empowering understanding in and of itself. The second thing is to create a feeling of safety in the body. Because if we don't feel safe, if we don't have a visceral feeling, we can't feel into the edges of our skin, we don't have a safe container to come back to, we might be hovering above ourselves in kind of a disembodied way, like an astronaut. If that's the case, we need to actually learn to come back to ourselves, create that feeling of safety. Because all of the responses that we have currently been involved in have happened because they are our body's best attempt to keep us safe in that situation. And what a beautiful thing that is. What a beautiful thing it is that we can shut down if we need to. What a beautiful thing it is that our body liberates this adrenaline and cortisol into the system if it feels like we need to get away from what it is that's presenting. But what we know to be true is that sometimes the information that the brain has is not correct for the situation. And then what we have to do is actually supply it with a whole new platform of sensory information so it can reconfigure its understandings about what's going on, and we feel better resourced and more empowered to make different decisions in the moment. That is ultimately where it's at. So from that place of safety, then we need to start to understand, okay, how is it that we can start to be more aware of when we're getting to the outer limits of our activation capacity? What can we do in that place? And then we start to introduce the mindful movement work. We're doing that way back at the start as well. But the take-home point that I want to say here is everything that I'm doing now involves us coming back down inside our window of tolerance. And that involves getting back in touch with our bodies, using mindful movement. And when I talk about movement, I'm not meaning exercise. I'm not talking about going for a run, although there's nothing wrong with going for a run. I'm talking about movement specifically designed to bring you out of fight, flight, and freeze or collapse. Very simple, not long sequences, easy to integrate. Things you can do on the ground and in the saddle also. Life-changing things for me. Beyond that, then it starts to get fun. It's fun at the beginning, but then we're starting to say, okay, now we've got this consolidated feeling of safety in our body. We can feel into the edges of our skin. We know where our center is. We have an understanding of what it means to be grounded, a felt sense understanding of what it means to be grounded. And now we're going to invite activation. We're going to increase our tolerance for activation. We're going to see if we can expand the capacity of what our body is able to hold. And then from that place, then we can start to refine things. Then we can start to recognize ourselves as the linchpin for our horses, where we can release things in our body, our physiology, in our mind, and have that transfer to them. It's so exciting. So all of this is a discussion, and I have a program for it called Joyride. And honestly, this is my invitation to you, that if this work appeals to you, If this story resonates with you in some way, please come and join me, because this has been such a life changer for me. Such a game changer in every respect. And I don't know what I did before I knew this stuff. So I've put it all together in a way that is really horse related, that ties in everything we're doing with these beautiful creatures and allows us to show up in a way that is creative, that is compassionate, that is effective, and that allows us to be able to tap into what we need in the moment. It's really exciting work. If you want to come and join me, Joyride is open at the moment, and the web address is confidentwriter.online/joyride. If you've got any questions, get in touch, but please don't stay stuck. If you feel like you need some help, just reach out and I will absolutely do my best to help you. But the purpose of this episode was just to really let you know how much is available to you and why it is you might feel the way that you do. So I hope you got something out of it. I'm really excited to be back online with these episodes. I've got lots of more fun stuff coming your way. Is that a thing? More fun stuff? I think we can always have more fun stuff, right? And I'm really looking forward to talking with you in the next episode. So I'll speak to you soon.